As Ben mentioned, my name is Zach Crockett. I work at the Oak Ridge National Lab on the KBase project on the outreach team. And I'll be talking about publishing data and narratives in KBase. And so I gave a similar webinar about this time last year, and this will be a little bit different. I'll cover some of the same stuff, but there will be some new features to show off. So if you're interested, you can go to our YouTube channel and view that other one. It's in the webinars playlist. And so to start out, just to give an overview of what we'll be going over, I've got a couple of quick poll questions to sort of gauge what everyone's familiarity with this is. Then I'll go over an overview of publishing your narratives through static narratives and talk a little bit about ongoing efforts on the KBase side, behind the scenes, what we're developing. And then give some tips and tricks for optimizing the static narratives that you publish. And I'll talk a little bit about this publishing community that we're trying to organize within the KBase user base. And so the first question, and you all can join the poll at slido.com and use this code to get in. The first question is, have you ever published a paper citing KBase? And then the next question is, have you ever published a paper with a public KBase narrative linked to it? Okay, so looks like a few, but not many. And that's been my experience when talking with KBase users, is that a lot of times once the analysis is done, it doesn't really make it into the public narratives. And so that's what I'm trying to promote here, is to get that data public and more fair. And so just a brief overview of what static narratives are and why they're important. So what it is, if you're not familiar, it's an openly available snapshot of your live KBase narrative, which is visible and findable for non-KBase users. So as you know, when you're working in KBase, you have to sign in to view your narratives to access your data. But with a static narrative, you can provide a preview, which will include many of the reports and will list the data objects and the app runs. Some of the information is still behind the login, but it will be publicly accessible from that narrative. And we also use the static narratives as a landing page for dataset DOIs, which we can mint those through the Department of Energy's Office of Science and Technical Information, or OSTI. So that static narrative is the originating point for the data. So if you make changes to the narrative that are cosmetic, if you correct a typo or something, we can change the landing page for the DOI so that it directs you to that most recent, most up-to-date narrative. And the why for why we think publishing narratives is important is that data can be a scientific product on their own merit. A lot of times the producers of data don't get credit for their work, and by encouraging our users to cite their narratives and to build up the network of citations for data, we can improve the metrics on that and make sure people are credited for their work. And the second thing is maintaining PIDs, or persistent identifiers, improves reproducibility, because when you cite your narrative in a paper, or when you say we did such and such in KBase, if you link to a static narrative, that means that other KBase users or non-KBase users can see what is done. They can copy that narrative and rerun it with their own data to replicate that study, or they can rerun it with new versions of apps to see what changes. And so as part of all that, we're working with a lot of other organizations and publishers to improve this data citation culture. And so some of these are OSTI, the IMSL, the Environmental Molecular, I'm forgetting the S laboratory, NMDC, the National Microbiome Data Collaborative, and more. And then another reason is the best way to share a KBase analysis in a paper is to use a static narrative, because as I mentioned with the DOIs earlier, it will stay constant. So if for some reason the link gets broken, or if you do need to change something, if you have a typo in your paper and you link to a static narrative, then it will always go to that typo version. But if you link to the DOI, we can update the landing page to direct to the most recent version. And this keeps up in principle, keeps up with some of the FAIR data principles, especially F4 and A1.2. These are really specific principles developed by the Go FAIR Foundation. And they essentially state that the F4 states that data should be searchable and registered in an indexable service. So by creating a static narrative, you can find static narratives through Google search if you know how to search for them. And if you have a DOI, you can find them through dataset services like Google Dataset Search or DataCite. And the A1.2 states in general that data don't necessarily have to be openly available. So it doesn't necessarily have to be immediately visible to the public, but there has to be a way to define how it can be accessed. And by providing a static narrative, you would be doing that. You would give them a landing page to where they can get to the data, and then they can create a KBase account to access them. And then the final altruistic reason to do it is to pay it forward within the KBase user community. KBase is a free service, and so when you make your data and analysis public, you give other users access to that and spread the knowledge within the KBase community. And if you've never created a static narrative before, it's pretty easy. This GIF is not playing, so I'll go through it later when I go into some narratives. But the gist of it is you just have to make sure your narrative is public, and then click on this share button, and there's an option to create static narratives. And so now I'll talk a little bit about some of the updates and improvements that have been made since the last version of this webinar. We've been working with the American Society for Microbiology Resource Announcements publication to develop some templates for our users. This is a really popular publication with our users. I think it's something like we have 50 genome announcements published with them. And it's a good pilot program for developing these templates that we want to expand the library of templates, because these workflows are generally pretty short and pretty consistent, and so it lends itself well to making these copyable templates. And this is also a good publication for students. I believe we do have a couple of those publications of KBase users where undergrads working with their professor to create these genome announcements. And the second thing we've not quite developed, but we've uncovered, I guess, a quirk of the way static narratives are set up, is that you can, in a way, control the author list by just giving anyone who needs to be listed as a co-author, you can give them a edit and save privileges on the narrative, and that will list them in the author list. In this case, in this version 9, I gave Ben edit privileges his narrative, and he shows up on the public facing landing page. And if you give someone edit access to review it, which a lot of users have done for me in the past, you can revoke that by changing them to view only or removing them entirely. And that is an option to help clean up your landing page a little bit and list only the authors involved, and as well as list the authors involved who may not have participated in depth in editing the narrative. And another feature we're working on is developing some metrics for these static narratives and DOIs. At the moment, we're working with DataCite to figure out what information on system needs to be tracked to accurately report copies and views of data sets, because as I mentioned, the static narratives are outward facing, so they would be indexed by things like Google, and the live narratives are behind the KBase login, so we have to do system metrics, and so we're consolidating those two things to get an accurate measure of the impact of static narratives and narratives with DOIs. So as you can see in this example, this particular workspace ID has been copied about 28 or 29 times, this 53247. And so when these get more fleshed out and developed, we'll be able to link those to the author's information and report that to things like DataCite Commons. And as you can see, they can link that to ORCID, which we're also developing more integrated links with ORCID, so that when all of this is fully developed, you'll be able to push these static narrative DOIs directly to your ORCID record and have that on your ORCID profile, as well as send the impact metrics to other sources to track the impact of your production in KBase. So if you haven't linked your ORCID already, I recommend you do that. There will be new features coming to make it a more robust interaction with ORCID. And so now I'll talk a little bit about optimizing the narratives. This slide, if you did attend last year, this slide is mostly the same. My biggest recommendation in general is to add markdown cells liberally all over your narratives to document and describe and record. We talk about narratives as electronic lab notebooks. So I encourage you to treat it like that and to document everything you do. And to format it, you can do formatting with either HTML if you're familiar with it, or Markdown. Markdown's a little bit easier to use, a little bit simpler, but HTML gives you more features. And this will allow you to make it more than just a plain text description. You can add formatting tips to make it more readable or more navigable. And so some of those tips and suggestions that I recommend is the very first thing I recommend for all narratives is to use a table of contents to keep it organized, and you can use internal linking using the A tag with HTML or the corresponding Markdown notation. And you can combine those two to create an interactive table of contents that will link you to relevant sections. And that's a really handy trick to avoid scrolling, especially if you have a very large narrative with tens or hundreds of app cells. Another thing I recommend adding is tables, pictures, and graphs to make it more informative. A lot of times these are in the narratives that I've worked with users on, these are lifted from their publication associated with the narrative. You can link, sometimes you can link directly to the image in the publication. And tables can generally be created pretty easily. And I'll show one in a narrative later in this webinar. They're pretty easy to generate, and they keep the information well organized in your markdown cells. One note about images, though, when you do link to an image, you have to make sure that wherever the image is hosted is stable. So options for that are in your own Google Drive or something like that, where you can control where the image availability, or in GitHub, where it's easily trackable. And then the final tip, which is also important and not immediately apparent to you when you're making a narrative, is that you need to make sure the narrative with the original objects is public. If you make a narrative that's kind of disorganized, and it's easier to start with a new one and copy the objects over, that is not a bad idea, as long as you link the two, so people can see the analysis. But if you don't make the original narrative public, then the copied objects will show up to other users as unavailable because they don't have access to those objects. So now I'm going to go over a few of the workflows and some examples of some good static narratives to give you some ideas for how you could organize yours. I put together these really simple maps or these simple workflow diagrams to show that there's different, all of these exist within KBase and our users now. So there's different ways to organize it. If you have a simple analysis and you know what you're doing from the start, a lot of times it'll look like this first one on the left, where it's just a straight path. You import, you say assemble, reads, annotate, and then build a metabolic model, and then you're done. This other workflow is similar to one by one of our users, where there was an RNA-seq workflow and a metagenomics workflow, and both were used in the publication, but they didn't, all the objects that were needed weren't in the same narrative. So we created this third narrative, which has links to both, and copied the final objects from each into that, so that way the important end result is immediately available, and then the process that led to that end result is findable through those other narratives. And then the third one is is best characterized by the MRA templates. As I mentioned earlier, I think we actually have, I think, 4 users that I'm working with that have MRA publications in various stages of development based on that template. And I think one of them actually is a professor with an undergrad student. And so now I'm going to jump into a few examples to sort of to demonstrate some of these. And so the first one is our Google Slides instead of Slido. The first one is one of our first, if not the first of our really polished MRA publications. This is developed by Dale Pelletier here at Oak Ridge. And as you can see, this shows a lot of the things I mentioned. It's got a link to the publication related to it, a table of contents, which is hyperlinked, so you can jump from the table of contents down to the references. Well, this link is broken. But you can see the references down at the bottom. In the static narrative, many of the reports are available here. And some of them aren't, so you need to log in to see this. But it tells you how to get to it. So it maintains that accessible facet of FAIR. And this is one I have edit access to, so I'll show what the GIF didn't show early in the presentation. If you were to edit a narrative, so if you have this narrative and there is a typo in it that I saw, it's feed site instead of field site. So I can correct that, save the narrative, and then manage. First, you have to make sure it's public, which this one is, and then you can manage static narratives and create a new static narrative. And so as you can see, the new narrative has the corrected info, but this link to the old narrative will still be available, and it will still look like what it looked like when this version was created. And so the second one is the example of this middle workflow where there's two different workflows leading into one result. And this author, Andrew St. James, who is, I believe, a professor at Wake Forest now, he has several narratives, I think actually 4 narratives associated with this, or 3. And he linked both of them. He made static narratives for the 2 main ones. And you can see those linked in here. And these have all the app runs and results. And then in this landing page narrative, it has just some documentation and a link to those others. And in the data tab, you can see the final mags that he used, final metagenome assembled genomes. And the final demonstration narrative I want to show is a bit of a preview. If you follow KBase, you may have seen this new sample feature. And this author, Joy Bongiorno at University of Tennessee, she created this narrative a little bit too early to actually use the import samples, but she provided a link to the bio project. And so she has this table of sample information now, which lists the collection information for all these samples. And now we have an import samples from NCBI app that will, if you get these sample IDs for this entire bio project, it will do a lot of this work for you. And you can directly import the sample information from biosamples and have it as a browsable object within your narrative, complete with a landing page where you can see things such as the location on the map, since it's provided in the sample site coordinates. And those are just a few examples of the different workflows that have been used in KBase. KBase is modular, so you can create your workflow however you please and however makes sense to you. And so I encourage you to create create your own path. And if you are ready to publish it, you can contact us. And so once you've completed your analysis and you've created that static narrative, you can create a DOI, or we can create one for you. And as I mentioned before, DOIs provide a way to resolve to the most current version of that narrative. And they allow indexing by external services. And so to request a DOI from us, just contact us and we will submit the form on your behalf. We have an account with OSTI to do this. And it's usually a turnaround time of a day or two for them to get it minted and for this data set to be findable online. And we're working on future development to make this process more automated and directly controllable by you as users within the narrative environment. But for now, it's pretty trivial for us to make changes. So one common one that if you create static narratives and DOIs, you'll most likely have those before your publication. So you can insert a placeholder into the narrative, saying publication pending or something along those lines. And then when it's available, we can link that we can link the static narrative to that. And so we can close the loop and connect those two scientific products. And so the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is this idea of a publishing community. We've had some great success. Ellen Dow, who's on the call with us, has organized this KBase educators community, which has been really popular with our users, and it's been really helpful for gathering people to create resources for each other to reuse them. And if you're interested in that, you can probably contact her if there are any professors on this call. And so in that vein, what I would like to do is to sort of crowdsource some of these resources for publishing. Things like a style guide for what narratives should look like and what are the minimal requirements for a community-defined high quality published narrative. Help produce templates for workflows that you do a lot and that you think other people may be interested in, and developing other resources such as formatting cheat sheets. We have one of those, but if there are other ideas you have to be included, you can contribute those. And some other things that we would be interested in is things like community calls. If there's interest, I would be open to hosting monthly calls for you to share what you're working on and get feedback from each other, and or if you are working with students, undergrads who are new to research and would like to practice giving talks about their publication, we can do that too. And the goal is to just make this a co-working community of KBase users and KBase to provide value for each other and sort of synergize our work. And in doing this, our benefit from this is that if you participate and provide us feedback, that helps us know what new features would be the most use for our users. And so if you are interested in that, I'll be following up to everyone who registered for this to get a sense for who might want to contribute, who might want to just look in, or who might like to take a role in developing any resources for the community. But if not, we're always open to registering narratives as data sets. So if you have a narrative that you're done with, be sure to contact us. You can contact engage@kbase.us or contact me directly. My email is in the Q&A doc. And we can do the simple things to highlight your work. We can tweet out. We often tweet out when new publications come out citing KBase. And so you can work with us to publicize it, and we can show it on our website, or whatever else we can think of together. And so that is the end of my presentation. If there are any...
Thanks for watching this webinar. For more webinars and tutorials, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can see announcements for upcoming webinars and recordings for previous webinars on our website at kbase.us/learn. Let us know in the comments what content you'd like to see in future webinars. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at DOE-KBase. And if you have questions or encounter an error when using KBase, please contact the help desk.